So I just want to say hi to everybody. My name is Christy Harper. I'm the president of the Houston HFES chapter, and we're the host for this event today. Today we will be hearing from Dr. Phil Kortum. He is a professor at Rice University, associate professor, and he's the author of the Usability Assessment book, and his talk is going to be on what's new in usability. We also have Angie Avera from Apple. She's a human factors UX researcher, and she is going to be the moderator or in charge of the Q&A. So you can put questions in the chat or you can direct message her. Angie, anything?
Yeah. So I'll be collecting questions throughout Dr. Kortum's talk. So if anything comes into your mind that you want to ask him, definitely, like Christy said, put it in the chat where everyone can see it. I'll collect from there, but you can also DM me and I'll kind of put those together so we have questions at the end.
Yeah, and if you want, you can introduce yourselves in chat, tell people where you're from and kind of get to know each other. And with that, I guess we can turn it over to Phil.
There we go. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what's new in usability and some of the things, some of the ideas that I talk about, I'm sure you've heard before. Obviously, a lot of folks who are on the talk are people who have done this work with me. And I'm going to revisit some older ideas as well, just to help you guys think about what kinds of things we might want to continue to do in the usability realm that I think advances our cause. It's pretty easy if you're doing usability on a day in and day out basis to forget that there's still new things happening and people doing research. One of the things that I always like to start with is just to talk a little bit about what makes something usable. And if we look at the ISO 9241-11 metrics, we know that if you can get it what you, whatever product you're using to do what you want it to do, then that's one important element. If you can do it in a reasonable amount of time, that's another. And of course, if that interaction meets your expectations. And so we get the three metrics of effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. And it's always helpful for me to step back and say, okay, so that's what makes something usable, but why are some things unusable? And so I'm just going to go through a couple of points here about why I think things become unusable. And then we'll jump into some of the new research that's going on. I think based on my experience, one of the big things that makes things unusable is oftentimes we focus on the machine or the system rather than the user. And the example I give here is, this is the B&O Century 2000 stereo system. And obviously you can tell it's quite old because it's got a cassette in there. But this was widely viewed in the music community as a statement piece. It was beautiful, it was well designed, but from a usability standpoint, until you knew all the tricks, it really wasn't very usable. And that's because they had a singular mission to make it cool rather than necessarily usable. And so we always have to worry about that. And there are some industries that are more prone to that than others. If you're making missile systems, you're not as prone to that. But if you're making watches, you're very prone to this. Oftentimes, the target audience changes, but the design doesn't. And so here on the left is, of course, we all know Ken Thompson, inventor of the C language, and he also did Unix. In fact, that's what he got into the National Academy of Inventors for, was his Unix contributions. And here he's playing a game of chess on a system that he programmed. And I'm sure that even in his wildest imagination, he never dreamed that small children would be playing on laptop computers. And so you look at some of the early chess programs and they were quite difficult to use. And that's because the target audience kept changing, but the base programs didn't. Obviously, if you're designing complex systems, sometimes it's just hard. So everyone recognizes the 3 Mile Island control center here, and it's just a complex system. It has to have lots of knobs and dials and displays. Now, were they laid out poorly and done incorrectly? Well, based on all the readings about 3 Mile Island that are out there, the answer is yes. but you're never going to get 3 Mile Island, you know, to operate on an iPad. It's just not going to happen. And so sometimes that's why things are hard. I'm sure we've all been on teams where there's the potential for good usability, but we just can't get the multiple people who have to contribute on the same page. And so the electrical engineers have done their job, and the mechanical engineers have done their job, and the usability people have done their job. But when you glue it all together, what you get is this mismatch. And so a product that could have been perfect or near perfect turns out to be not so perfect, even though everyone did their job perfectly, right? And so this is one thing as usability specialists that we have to we have to keep in mind as we do our work. And oftentimes, strangely enough, we're the glue that has to hold that process together. And we've all seen this cartoon as well. The design and the implementation just don't match. And so somebody says, hey, this is the design we want to do. And by the time it goes through all of the teams and all of the committees, what comes out on the other end is sort of a shadow of what we think it actually should be. And so with that, I'm just going to transition into some of the new things that I think are going on in usability. This first one is one that we haven't made a lot of progress on, but I just want to talk about it because, again, as we start talking about complex systems, we've been thinking about in my laboratory how we can measure large complex systems at scale. And so that becomes more and more important. So if I were to ask anybody on this call, how would we measure the usability of this? We would say, well, this is a trivial experiment. And all we have to do is get a couple dozen bottles of beer and we see if people can open them. And then we measure success and how long it took them to open the beer. And if they enjoyed opening the beer. And so measuring simple systems is really quite easy if you do it right, of course. If we look at a slightly more complex system, this is your typical digital watch. It's more complex, but it's still pretty easy to measure, right? I come up with the kinds of tasks that I think people might do. I set the alarm, I set the time, I run a stopwatch, and I have people work on those small tasks. And so again, pretty easy. When I move into more complex systems, like this 787 cockpit, it becomes more difficult to measure global usability. Obviously, one way you can do it is you can use scenario-based tasks, right? And so you say, I want to test how easy it is to land the aircraft. And so you can do that, or you can measure all the subsystems. But it becomes a more onerous task to measure usability in a complex system like this. When we step even further back, these are the new littoral combat ships, the USS Independence and Coronado. And we say, if the Navy came to you and said, hey, are these ships usable? At scale, this becomes a much, much more difficult question. And so again, you can use some scenario-based items, but you have to think more globally than even scenarios. And so my lab has been thinking about these things. The verdict on these particular ships, however, I think has come back that they're not usable. And in fact, these two particular ships are being retired after only 6 or 7 years in service, which for a naval fleet vessel is unheard of. And a lot of it had to do with what we would call hardcore usability issues. And one of the big features of these ships is that they were supposed to be configurable, and they had what they called mission modules. And so you could open up the back door and you'd say, we're going to do submarine interdiction. And so you had submarine interdiction mission modules, and you were just supposed to plug those modules in, and all of a sudden you had a submarine hunter. And that system, which sounds great the way I just described it, it turns out that it didn't work like that. And it was the usability of changing, modifying, moving, installing, uninstalling those modules was too great. And so we've been trying to figure out how to measure usability at system scale. And again, I don't have anything to report. Maybe in a year or two, I'll come back and we'll talk about really grand things for that. I'd like to talk a little bit about what's happening with geographic usability. A question that we asked several years ago was, does the assessment of usability depend on the location of the user? And this came from a lot of questions on projects that I had worked on where we would get test results on participants in one city and the marketing folks would come back and say, no, no, no. I know you tested those users in Austin, but our users are in California, and California people are special. And so we were curious as to whether locality made a difference. And in marketing, it really, really does. Like you don't run ads for freezers in Antarctica or space heaters in Death Valley. And so a lot of what marketing's influenced by was this specific locality. And so Claudia, Simi, and I did a lot of this work. We wanted to know if usability followed the same model. And so what we did is we went out and measured the usability for 11 common products, things like Gmail and iPhones and microwaves and Microsoft Word. And we measured them in all 50 states and then looked to see if we could detect differences in the usability of those items across different geographic locations. And it turns out that we could not. And we've replicated this study with other items as well, most notably mobile applications, and didn't find any difference there either. And so we're quite confident that it's not a factor, particularly if you recruit along, if you make the same recruiting, right? So you can't recruit computer experts in California and cowboys in Texas. You have to recruit similarly. But if you recruit similarly, you will get similar results. Another thing that's been going on in my lab for quite some time and continues to go on, so maybe it's not new, maybe it's just a continuation, is this idea of benchmarking. And we think benchmarking is really important because it helps other researchers get data for comparison. Importantly, and this is why I started doing it initially 30 years ago, was it serves, sorry, still have a landline. It serves as a useful tool for communicating to non-usability professionals like managers. And so rather than trying to encapsulate an entire study, you can say, look, these are benchmarks to which we can compare our current product, and it provides a common language. And of course, from a future research standpoint, it's helpful to characterize what the global psychometric properties of these measurement devices are. And so by continually benchmarking these, we can do that. And we've done this across a huge number of telecommunications products, over 300 telecommunications products, upwards of 14 different everyday products, and a whole host of mobile products across different delivery platforms. And anybody who's picked up any of my papers will recognize this chart, and this is just one of the benchmarking charts that shows what the system usability score is for a variety of these everyday objects. And so if you test something and somebody says, well, I don't really understand how usable it is, and you say, well, it's not as usable as Excel, and they go, oh, okay, I get that. And so we think benchmarking is an important part of ongoing usability efforts. Environmental usability is something that one of my postdocs, Claudia Simeon, got me interested in. And we were interested in if different environments could lead people to give different usability ratings for systems. And so the place we decided to test this out was in the voting environment. And so here's just an example of one of the studies that we did where we looked at all these different ways of laying out a voting precinct. And so you can see at the top, we spaced out the voting booths differently. In some cases, they had dividers, and in some cases they didn't. And then we looked at the configurations of the rooms, in which in some cases voters were facing each other, or they were facing the back of the room, or they were facing the front of the room. And we asked people to judge the usability of each of these voting centers by viewing a series of photographs, or not photographs, these are photorealistic renderings. And the reason we did it this way is so that we could, the environment, like the lighting, the lights, the floors, etc., were held constant, and we could simply look at these different configuration elements. And it turns out there is, we use the adjective rating scale that we described in a paper in 2009 that maps very well back to the SUS. It turns out that there's a big difference based on the global voting environment. And so the least quote usable environment is where you're voting face-to-face with no spacing and no dividers. And the most usable is when you're facing the door and you're spaced and there are dividers. And so there may not be tremendous differences within small conditions, but across widely varying conditions, you can see that there's a, we've gone from near awful to near excellent. And so we're continuing to explore what kinds of elements can impact usability because it has some implications for how you might design certain kinds of systems. Individual differences is something that has been very fascinating for me to get involved in. Fred Oswald, who's a psychometrician at Rice University, has been working with me on this. And it was quite an eye-opener for me. We normally think of usability as being typically uniform. For example, we work a lot with means. And so we test 30 participants, we measure mean effectiveness, we get their SUS scores, we measure mean SUS scores, and we assume that if we select on a demographic and we do so appropriately, then we assume that there's low variability across participants. And we select on things like age and gender and education and experience. And for some things we know that there's not a lot of individual difference. We don't see huge differences in age or gender or education. And I'm using SUS scores as the metric here. Experience, we know Camille Paris has published evidence on this with Andy, and I've published some evidence that experience is very strong, but as long as you control for it, you're in good shape. One of the things that got us thinking was this idea about cognitive ability. We know that cognitive ability predicts lots and lots of stuff. So if I can get your IQ, I can pretty accurately predict things like your socioeconomic status, what you're earning. I can predict what your job performance metrics look like or what your school performance looks like. And it's actually so predictive that I can tell you when you're likely to die based on your IQ, and I can tell you how healthy you are. And so we wondered, given its high predictive ability, could we predict how people would rate usability based on knowing their cognitive ability? I'm sure we've all seen this axiom out there, there are no stupid users. We ran some pilot studies, pretty big, 250 folks, and the preliminary data suggested that maybe there are. We saw a reasonable predictive power. The thing we worried about is that we had a very high range restriction on age. And so we're out in the field now collecting data from folks from age 18 to age 85. And we're looking to see if we replicate this preliminary data. If we do, it has huge implications for subject recruitment. And so I'm actually hopeful that we don't see something here simply because it would complicate all of our lives tremendously. But if we don't see it, I think we do have to go back and ask the question, why? Cognitive ability predicts so much. We'd have to understand why it's not predicting this, if that's how it turns out. Another area that Dr. Oswald pushed me into was personality. He's done lots and lots of work on measuring personality. He's the author of the mini IPIP instrument. And we know that personality is highly predictive, again, for job performance, for judging leadership, for academic performance. You can predict creativity. You can predict political behaviors if you understand what people's personality is. And so we wanted to understand if maybe there were some personality predictors for the perception of usability. And so we used the so-called Big Five personality traits, the 5-factor personality model, which measures emotional stability, extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And it turns out that there is a small but reliable impact of personality with subjective usability. And so openness to experience is positively correlated, as is agreeableness. And so the effect sizes are not huge, but it does tell us something. And so interestingly, conscientiousness did not turn up. And that was interesting, because typically conscientiousness you would expect it to be positively correlated with something like this. And our hypothesis is that conscientiousness is also highly correlated with perfectionism. And so you may be expecting more if you're highly conscientious from a system. Another area that we've been doing a lot of work in recently is this area of usability and trust. And you might not normally think of trust and usability going hand in hand. But in some task critical domains, usability is one factor that we worry about in trust. And we found, as we're building these instruments to measure trust, that those systems have to be usable in order for people to trust them as well. And so one area that we've been working in this domain in is voting, of course, because that's one of the things that I do a lot of. And I'll just give you an example. Here's a high security voting system. It's called Pret-a-Voter. And it's hard to use, and people don't trust it. And so what you have to do is you get this ballot, and you can see the names are on the left-hand side, and those names are random across every ballot. And then what you do is you mark an X next to the name that you want to vote for. And then that little line down there is a dotted line, and you detach the left-hand side that has all the names, and you grind those up in the paper shredder. And then you just cast the right side that just has the X. And so people don't trust that. And they also do all kinds of crazy things, like they grind up the right-hand side rather than the left-hand side. They make lots of mistakes with this, but they don't trust the system because you have to believe that somehow the system knows that the name that you selected is the name that you put the X next to. And without understanding all the complicated code that goes behind this, you don't really get that. Here's another high security system that we've tested called Scantegrity 2. And you use a special decoder pen to uncover the bubble, and it has a code in there. This has a very small code. Most of the codes are 4 to 6 digits. And then what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to write down those codes and then transfer those onto the ballot. So you never really vote for Thomas Jefferson, you vote for 62875. And then you have to trust that 62875 gets translated into Thomas Jefferson on the back end. And so obviously there are a whole bunch of usability issues with that. People transcribe the codes wrong. They forget, right here you can see somebody wrote Pres-ZK. And so they'd have to remember that that was president, and that that wasn't a 2, that was a Z. And so there's usability issues with it, but people also didn't trust that the system was doing what they thought it would do. And so when we look at high, medium, and low usability systems, and then we measure that against trust, you can see that that's highly correlated. And so this was important for us to understand. We came up with this instrument called the Trust in Voting Systems Survey that allows us to measure trust in any voting system. And you can see that system usability is one of the major factors. And so it's not it's not a dominant factor, but it's still an important factor that has to be considered when you create these kinds of systems. Ian Robertson, one of my graduate students, and I have been working with Fred Oswald and Claudia Simeon on measuring trust in self-driving cars as well, under a grant from Ford Motor Company. And I'll just jump right to the chase here. This is the trust in self-driving cars survey. And you can see there are 4 major factors here, and usability is one of them. And so even in a self-driving car where you might not think that usability is an important factor, it's like, hey, I'm not doing anything. Why does it have to be usable? But we still have to interact with it. And so it still has, I have to tell it where I'm going. I have to make sure that I understand what it's doing. If I give it correctional advice while we're driving, it has to do that. And so there is a big usability component. And so the idea is that you can take this instrument and modify vehicle parameters and then see if the trust goes up. So if I use a female voice in the car rather than a male voice, does that change how people trust the vehicle? Or if I change the braking dynamics, in one case it brakes harder, and in the other case it brakes more softly. And so one can imagine there are a huge number of experimental variables that you could change. And this is what Ford is doing now with our instrument. They're systematically working through a huge number of variables to help make better self-driving cars. And then this is just to demonstrate that the instrument works. You can see we gave people a low trust scenario, a simulated, we used scenario-based, these are scenario-based, a low trust scenario and a high trust scenario, and the instrument is quite powerful in detecting differences in those. Another thing new and interesting that's happening is alternatives to in-person testing, and this is really appropriate given everything that's going on with COVID-19 right now. This is work that Ian Robertson has been leading. And the idea is that there might be benefits to using methods other than our typical use then measure, right? Typically we bring someone into the lab, we say use this, we measure what they're doing, and then we ask them to measure, to rate subjective usability. We've had tremendous success with retrospective usability. We've done thousands, probably 30,000 measurements at least on retrospective usability, and have had great success with that. And that's where you ask somebody, hey, you've been using this, could you just tell me about the usability? We wanted to know if we could get equally good results with prospective usability, which we've been working on for quite some time without success, where you show somebody something and say, hey, can you tell me how usable it is before they use it? And you might laugh and say, well, why would you ever do that? But think about how you shop on Amazon. You look at items and you're making assessments of usability based on a variety of factors. And that's a method of prospective usability assessment. The one that we're really excited about, however, is watching others. We were wondering if we couldn't leverage someone else's experience in order to get a good assessment of usability. So if I could record somebody using a system and then have other people watch and then make ratings of the usability, that would be extremely valuable, particularly in a COVID environment, or in an environment where the system is too complex. You know, I want to test a new reactor core management system, and I don't want to have to bring all these super specialized people in. So I just have them watch someone else use it and then get their reactions on it. And so it turns out that we did this with a couple different systems, from simple to, I would say, moderately complex. And you can see that use then measure, the typical way that we measure usability, is comparable to retrospective, but watching others and prospective are not as predictive. They don't match up to the use then measure. And so we've got some hypotheses about why this might be, and it turns out that another one of my graduate students, Rosalind Shanklin, is now in the process of exploring we're particularly focusing on watching others, the parameters of those videos to see if we can get them to be equivalent from a measurement standpoint to typical use then measure. And so watch this space for that. I'm really excited to see what we can find out there. This is new work about modifying the system usability scale. Anybody who knows me knows that the SUS is something I've been interested in for a long, long time. But one of the big questions we always get asked is, can I not use one or more of the questions? And in some contexts, not all the SUS questions make sense. And if people leave them in, then that obviously degrades the reliability of the instrument because people don't know how to answer that question. And I'll give you an example here in a second. And so oftentimes what happens is researchers abandon the instrument, or oftentimes they just modify it in inappropriate ways. And so they change stuff and then don't realize that they've changed the psychometrics of the instrument. And so they're not really measuring, they may not be measuring what they think they're measuring. And so here's a great example. If I'm testing an EpiPen and question 1 says, I think I would like to use this product frequently. Well, nobody wants to use this product frequently. And so even if the device is highly usable, that one question could throw it off because you'll say, no, I don't want to use this frequently, even though it may be super usable across all the other categories. And so dropping that question seems like a reasonable thing to do. And Lewis and Sorrow just recently determined that you can actually drop a question, and you can drop any of them. Although question number 1 is one that is most frequently cited for dropping. And when you drop it, the reliability of the instrument remains high with alphas over 0.9, and the comparability to other SUS scores also remains very high. And all you have to do is rescale by using a different multiplying factor. So instead of multiplying by 2.5, which you do for normal scoring, after you make all the adjustments, you multiply by 2.777. And so if you're going to do this, I would really, really encourage you to go out and read Lewis and Sorrow's paper on scoring and not use my slide, because there are some subtleties to it. But this is super important work because it makes the SUS instrument that much more powerful. And it's something that people had not systematically considered before. I'm going to end the talk by talking with a little bit about usability as a path to innovation. This probably isn't new, but it's something that I try and evangelize all the time because I talk to a lot of people, and they often think that usability does not contribute in this way. And so lots of people, including people in our profession, see usability as a gatekeeper. Right? People talk about getting through usability. I just need to get that usability box checked. You don't ever hear anybody say, I just need to get mechanical engineering to sign off, right? People want it to be mechanically correct. And so we should think that with usability too. And oftentimes usability's function is just seen as test, write a report, and then move on to the next product. And I'd like to convince you that actually we have a much bigger role than that. In my experience, usability can drive innovation in all kinds of important ways. And actually, we should be on the cutting edge of innovation because we're seeing the kinds of issues that maybe no other team has seen. And we shouldn't just report those. We should say, here's how you can improve systems. And so I'm just going to give you 3 quick examples. One that I've talked about before and that is given as a case study in my usability book is the development of the DSL self-installation kit. And when I first got this project, only 5% of our customer base was attempting self-installs. And of that 5% who were attempting self-installs, 95% of them were failing. And the president of the company said, we'll always need to roll a truck out to a customer's house to do this. And the vice president for operations said, self-installation is impossible, right? And so that was, and then I was handed that plate and said, hey, can you do some usability tests and fix this? And so obviously, we could have done the usability tests, and we did with network interface boxes. And you actually have to go in and do surgery on them, pretty significant surgery to get DSL installed. And when you do that, yeah, it's almost impossible, except for people who have specific knowledge. And some people just won't do it. When you say, you know, they think they're in a James Bond movie, cut the red wire, and so they just won't do it. And so the preliminary test told us exactly what we thought, that it was impossible to do. But we used this as an invitation to innovate, to figure out what to do. And so I put over 1,000 users through my lab and in the field to do this. I analyzed thousands of hours of inbound calls to the help centers, and I wrote along on lots and lots of truck rolls to look at failed installations in the field to figure out what was going on. And in the end, what came out of this is a revolution that changed the DSL industry. AT&T invented the DSL splitter that eliminated the need to do surgery on the box. Essentially, you plugged this in, and all the surgery that you did out on the box was now being done in this little white box down here on the left. The DSL modems were complicated and didn't provide good feedback. And so we designed our own modems where the lights came on in a specific fashion. The temporal flashing of each of the lights was matched. It's all color coded. And so we developed this new DSL modem, and we built all new code and support structures. And so we systematically worked on the software. And so until eventually, the last kits that went out had no software that the user had to worry about. We systematically reduced the instruction sets until at the end, there were no instruction sets except plug your modem in. And then everything else happened. And there was a complicated registration process. And by the end, there wasn't one. It worked like Ethernet, right? You plugged it in, boom, and you were ready to go. And so we fundamentally changed the entire process through innovation, when we could have just done the usability test and said, boy, that's hard, right? You guys should do something. But instead, usability and human factors engineers led the charge on completely rewriting the story on this. And by the time we were finished, 95% of the installations were happening via self-install, and only 5% of those people were failing. And so we saved the company hundreds of millions of dollars recurring because of that. Another interesting project that we've been working on that shows that innovation can be important is in the area of rehabilitation health designs. I got to working with Dr. Marcy O'Malley at Rice, and she's developing these gloves that support people who have had a stroke, for example. And so you can put this glove on and operate it in a way that allows you to manipulate items that you might not normally be able to do because you didn't have sufficient hand control. And here you can see they're doing a block test where they pick up these blocks and stack them in a specific fashion. We evaluated this with over 600 users in a survey-based system. And we were interested, when we started out, we were interested in trying to understand the usability of actuating individual items, individual fingers, so people could manipulate the glove, and how that worked on benchmark metrics. But it turns out, as we started to analyze the data, we figured out very quickly that this was not the problem that people really were interested in. And the problem that people were suffering from with the gloves that they were currently using was putting the glove on and taking the glove off. And so the idea was, these are supposed to be, these people have a disability, but they want to be independent. And so they want to put the glove on without help, and they want to take the glove off without help, so that then they can do all their tasks. And they were struggling with that primary task. And so we ended up shifting the focus of our research, and we're starting now on trying to come up with self-donning and self-doffing gloves, sort of a, a Project Iron Man thing, where the putting it on and taking it off becomes the critical function, and then we'll work on the other things later. And so this was, again, through the usability examination, we determined that maybe we were looking at the wrong problem, And now we're trying to attack that other problem. And of course, the last thing is any of you who attended the Human Factors Symposium, I don't know, 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, we had a speaker who talked about global health designs. And this is an area where usability is one of the primary factors. Obviously, efficacy of the device is of primary concern, but you're working in areas of sub-Saharan Africa where there can be low literacy, little training or support once the initial installation has happened, and these systems are mission critical, and the systems need to be walked up and used. And this is the Pumani bubble CPAP, and what it does is it helps premature babies breathe by inflating their lungs ever so slightly so they can breathe with less effort. And so you can see there's an infant here who's on the Pumani bubble CPAP. And there's a whole host of technologies. It's called NEST, the Newborn Essential Technologies, that are being developed right now that are utilizing high levels of human factors in their innovation stage, not just in their evaluation stage, but trying to figure out how to innovate in order to create designs that are superior to anything that's being offered in developing world. And so again, another area where I think innovation and usability go hand in hand. And so I hope that I've convinced you that there are a lot of new and fun and interesting things going on in usability, and that we need to continue to study it because it helps us save lives. Obviously, it helps us save money. It helps the users save time and helps the users save frustration. And as Christy mentioned, if you're interested in more, I would encourage you to examine the Human Factors Methods series, which is being published by the Human Factors Ergonomics Society. And I'm the editor-in-chief of this right now. They're really short. They're under 100 pages typically, and the goal is skill acquisition. And so people are supposed to be able to pick up one of these books and pick up the necessary skills to do a specific method. And so usability assessment and questionnaire design and workload assessment and task analysis are out right now. Situational awareness, mental models, knowledge acquisition, and risk analysis are currently being written, and those should be on the shelves shortly. And so one thing I would encourage you is if you have a topic in mind that you say, gosh, I wish there was one of these orange books for X, shoot me a note. I'm always looking for new, interesting ideas to help fill out this methods series. So thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate being invited today. And now I'm happy to entertain any questions that have come up.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a super interesting talk. I'm very grateful for it, for you kind of distilling down all of these new insights in a very digestible way. I did have a decent amount of questions roll in, and people can continue to send them. We'll get through as many as we can, and they may feel like they're jumping around because, you know, that's how they come in. But to start, sort of a clarifying question around usability and trust. Is it that perceived usability, or like the actual usability of the system, impacts trust, or is it that the trust someone has in the system will impact how they rate the usability? Is it both directions? Can you talk a little bit more about that relationship?
I think it's probably both directions. I think that the direction that we've been exploring has been, does usability impact the measurement of trust, not the other way around? And so what we want to know, we're developing unit measures for trust. And so we look at all the elements that go into that, and trust happens to, or usability happens to be one of those elements. And so I think something has to be usable to be trusted. I don't know that we've demonstrated that something has to be trustworthy to be usable, right? One can imagine systems that are easy to use, but you're like, I don't trust that. But it's hard to imagine a system where you struggle and struggle to use it and you go, but boy, I trust that. It took me 2 hours to cast my vote, but by golly, it's good. It's happened. And so at this point, I think we've demonstrated one direction, but I don't know that we've demonstrated both directions.
And then kind of following on to that, if, increasing the usability of a system kind of can increase the user's trust in the system, I guess as sort of a metric, are there other things that happen when a system is trusted by the user? So is that like there's like wider brand adoption once they trust one product, they'll continue with it? Or like, what's the justification for, like, I guess in voting, it's obvious we want to like have trust, but what about in maybe like consumer products?
Sure. And so, like you say, in voting, it seems intuitive that we want to trust the systems that we vote in. But for example, the CEO of Ford Motor Company said, I wouldn't get in a self-driving car right now, right? And so, and he's committed his company to creating self-driving cars shortly. And so it's a matter of product survival. If you don't trust, let's say self-driving taxis come out of the gate first, and there are self-driving taxis out there and they're still Uber. If you don't trust a self-driving taxi to get you to your destination safely, and that's multidimensional, it's not just usability, but you don't trust it to do that, you're going to call an Uber, right? And so Ford will sell all these cars, all these automated taxi companies will go out of business, and it's because the trust model is incorrect. And so I think there's a huge financial incentive to do this. And in some cases, trust can make or break companies. If let's say you're using a backup drive and it's viewed to be unreliable, you're not going to trust that and you're going to stop buying it. Right. And so there's lots of dimensions of trust, but it has direct impacts on people's adoption. And so I think and continued use. If you're using a computer program and it crashes every, third stroke, you're done. You don't trust it enough anymore.
Swoops in.
Exactly.
Makes sense. Kind of a pretty specific question, but on the line of self-driving cars, do you know what types of things impact perceived usability and trust in that domain?
We don't. We just came up with the instrument. It's just hot off the press, and we're now systematically, we're approaching things that we can do right now. We don't own a self-driving car, and so we're looking at things like security. And there's other things. Ford is looking at a lot of the operational parameters, and I think there's years worth of studies there. But certainly, the degree to which the system is anthropomorphized may have big impacts. The vehicle dynamics, does it brake, does it turn, does it corner? The ability of the vehicle to communicate its intentions to you, like, hey, I'm slowing down because I think there's an accident ahead. It needs to tell you that. Otherwise, you're like, why is it slowing down? Go faster, right? And so I think there's a lot of elements that need to be explored and understood, but we're just at the beginning of that.
Makes sense. Getting a few questions rolling in. So, okay, so this one says, if you were to embed some of the questions from the trust scale that you mentioned into a survey, are there ones that are most important to include, or would you encourage implementation of a full trust assessment?
So I'm not sure. Are you talking about using the SUS as part of a trust metric, or?
And this is someone else's question, but so I wasn't sure if maybe there was. So in general, maybe if to clarify the question, if you want to assess trust in a system, yes. Is there a specific scale you would recommend, or are there is it a couple questions you can get at it, or is it like SUS and that it needs to be a package?
It needs to be a package, right? So you can certainly ask, do you trust system X? But the problem is you don't get any dimensionality in that. And so it's much harder than when people say, no, I don't, to then figure out where you need to buff and polish in order to make that system better. And so we've come out ourselves with several systems, one specific to self-driving cars and one specific to voting systems. And it's been demonstrated that trust is technology specific. And if you want to measure trust in almost any system, you can go out and find a specific instrument to measure that. There's trust in automation, there's trust in computers, So there's a variety of scales that you should go out and look to get that specific domain, and then use that instrument because A, it's got benchmarks, and B, it's been validated so that the measurement comes back, you know exactly what you've measured.
Makes sense. So there's a few questions specific to the SUS questionnaire. So you kind of talked a bit about dropping a question. So one question that came up is there a point of no return for dropping SUS questions or skipped questions? Like how do you?
That's a great question, and we don't know the answer to that yet.
Okay.
And so it's a project I'm going to sick one of my students on. Sorrow and Lewis only dropped one question, and they systematically dropped each question, but they only dropped it. And so one can imagine that you could create a giant matrix where you would drop every combination of 2 and every combination of 3 and every combination of 4, etc.
Good luck
And
to that.
then you could measure whether the SUS remained reliable. And so it's a huge, fabulous project, but we don't know the answer to that.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll keep us posted. And then in terms of how do you feel about modifying the phrasing or the wording of the question?
So Sorrow and Lewis and my lab have both demonstrated that you can make specific modifications. So for example, the original SUS says system. I trust this system. And you can change that to say product, or you can change it to say the name of the product. So you can say, I would like to use this iPhone frequently, and that does not change the reliability of the system. And so that's a reasonable modification. Years ago, Finstad's lab and my lab simultaneously came to the conclusion that in question 8, the word cumbersome, I found the system cumbersome to use, was not well understood.
Yeah, it's not really that plain language.
Yeah, and so we changed that to awkward, and interestingly, Finstad independently made the exact same suggestion. And so, but then when we made that change, we went back and revalidated the instrument. And so now everything that's coming out of my lab is using the modified SUS, where question 8 is different. And it's something you worry about, but aside from those changes, any change you make risks changing the reliability and validity of the instrument. And so if you start tweaking stuff, it's no longer the SUS, it's Angie's SUS, right? It's now a completely different instrument. And that's one of the reasons, one of my graduate students just finished a great project, and I didn't talk about this today, I should have, but we've released what we call the SUS pack. It's was just accepted for publication in IJHCI. And it's 5 of the most common language, the SUS has been translated and validated in 5 of the most common languages, the power languages, what we call, where there's a good chance that the instrument would actually be used in that language. And it was an enormous, enormous undertaking because we had to get them translated. We did forward and backward translations. We did triple checks on the translations. Then we did validity studies and reliability studies. It was a big, big, giant effort. And that's because if you just make a translation, you could turn a phrase, you could change it, you could make it so it was different. And so we made sure that a SUS in German, a SUS in simplified Chinese gives the same results that a SUS in English gives to native speakers. And so changing the wording is a definite, I see it everywhere, but it's a definite no-no. You shouldn't do it.
Okay, good to know. And that's such a big offering to the community to sort of have these translated, validated SUS evaluations. So
we were super excited.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so I'm going to rewind a little bit to where you were talking about geographic usability. That was really interesting to me. We talk a lot about, right, I live and work in California, so sometimes like, do we need to get out of this bubble of Silicon Valley when we're doing usability tests. So when you mentioned, when we saw that map, was this only for SUS scores where it was sort of pretty uniform across the country? Someone asked, did you look at issue detection or any other?
No, we didn't. It was simply evaluation of SUS scores. And so, and the reason I know those geographic areas look weird, but the reason we do that is those are the geographic regions that are identified by the United States Census Bureau. And so there's a whole bunch of other statistics behind them that then you can drag in. So you can say, oh, we want to know how educated the people in there are, how old they are on average, et cetera, income. And so by using those as the markers, it helps us do the research, and it also helps us equalize samples, right? Otherwise, the likelihood that I'm going to get enough people from Vermont, right? The number of people in Vermont, is equal to 2 square blocks to the number of people in California, right? And so it's, well, and I say that jokingly, but if you look at Wyoming, there are more people within a 2-mile radius of my house than there are in all of Wyoming, right? And so for me to make these kinds of usability comparisons would be very difficult on a state-by-state basis. So by using those geographic regions, but we only measured system usability scores. But it's important that you match, if you need lumberjacks who wear green plaid and carry axes that are at least 36-inch long, then you need to make sure that whether you're recruiting from California or Michigan, that you get lumberjacks who wear green shirts who carry axes that are 36 inches long. If you change that, right, if you just say, I'm just going to reach into the population and grab people at random, then of course you'll get different results, right? Because if I reach into Silicon Valley and ask people to figure out how to use a new coding device, and I reach in to an area of the country where high tech is not prevalent, of course I'll get differences, but those were easily explained by demographic variables, not by, hey, Californians are different.
Right. So all else the same, just location as your defining factor.
Precisely. But for folks like in marketing, it does make a difference, right? And so, which is why we looked at it, because so many marketing folks said, oh, you can't use Texans for Californians, right? There's this specialness. And I just didn't believe it. And so.
And maybe it depends on what you're trying to learn. So, right, like you said, this is usability. Maybe there could be other research questions that are in the UX HF space that makes sense that there could be differences. And that's kind of probably marketing's research has shown them.
Of course. And I think the difference is, if we're just measuring hardcore usability, what we're interested in is performance metrics. Yeah. And so performance metrics, I mean, if you start asking people, how do you feel about this? Right. Then absolutely, that starts to bleed into the marketing side of the equation.
So another question just rolled in on this topic. What about on a global level? Do we think across the world?
So we would love to do that study. There is evidence that there are cultural differences, even in performance metrics. And so, but a lot of the cultural studies that have been published out there are sort of they're not just working on the exclusive performance metrics. They're doing things like needs analysis and things like that. And so if you're doing that kind of design work, then I think there are probably differences. People want to interact with their computers differently. David Lane did some fascinating work where the computer, the amount of, and I'm blanking on the word, but it was essentially the amount of meanness. So the computer either said, you're making mistakes, stop it. Or the computer would say, there appear to be a lot of mistakes being made that might be part of the system. And so maybe if we change behaviors in this way, it will get better. And there have been some studies that show that there are large cultural differences for those kinds of things. But if you say, here's a device, how many minutes does it take to use it? It's probably less likely. But the studies that have been published have been less, have not drawn that bright line between performance and other kinds of statistics. I would love to replicate this geographic study.
Another project for a student. We got some massive.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, and that would be so fun to collect usability data from all over the world. That would be a great project.
We've got the SUS scores ready to go, translated into other languages, or the assessments.
Yeah. And we could hit all 5 countries that we did, and so that was ready to go. All I need is a student.
I think there are some in this chat based on what I saw. So. Yeah, I think I'm not sure exactly what our end time was, but I'm going to keep going. People are still on the call, so I have a couple more questions. One question was around the adjective rating scale that you mentioned.
Yes.
I hadn't seen that before, and so I was just curious, how do you use that? Is that instead of a SUS score? Is it just one question? Is it also multiple questions? Yeah.
So it comes out of a paper that Aaron Banger and Jim Miller and I wrote back in 2009, and it's in the Journal of Usability Studies. And the idea was we were really struggling. We were using the system usability scale, but our management still wasn't getting, we'd say, look, this works just like university grading scale, and they still weren't getting it. And so we decided we needed to attach adjectives to it. And so we created this adjective scale that you just say, how usable is this device? And it runs from worst imaginable to best imaginable. And so it's just a single score, and it gives you a word. And so you build a histogram of adjectives, and you say, well, 80% of our people think it's best imaginable interface ever, right? And so, and it was a way to help us communicate to our management. It turns out, you noticed when we measured the usability of environments, when we did the voting environments, that I didn't use the SUS, because the SUS really didn't make sense there in the same way. Like, I felt the instructions, that I needed the help of a technical person. Well, it doesn't really make sense. But if I say, how usable is this system? And I give them these 7 points, it's a much easier question to answer. So there's some circumstances where the adjective rating scale is actually really beneficial and is easier for users and easier for the experimenters to deploy.
I have a question. I've seen sometimes people take the SUS and they kind of turned it into like a letter grade. Is there a way you can take a SUS assessment and then retroactively apply the adjective scale?
Yes. And in fact,
that sort of phrasing.
Yeah. So if you look in the 2009 paper, the adjective rating paper, there's a figure in there that translates the adjective rating scales into SUS scores, and it also translates them into grades. And it also translates them into an acceptability scale that says this device is acceptable, it's low or high marginally acceptable, or it's not acceptable. Now, if you're going to translate into grades, I would encourage you to go out and look at Saro's work, because Saro disagrees with our translation. And in his translation, the grades are slightly lower. So he uses a cumulative distribution method, and we chose not to do that for specific reasons. And so his grading scale is slightly different, not huge, and it gets worse down at the bottom. But if you're up in the 80s, you're okay. But if you got a 60, that might be a 50 in his score. And so I would encourage you to look at that and then make your own decision. Obviously, I think ours is better, but there is another opinion about what that grade scale is. It's not cut in stone.
Okay. I'm going to ask 2 more questions just to give everyone on the line sort of an idea of where we're at. So one question is related to the personality. You kind of mentioned different elements of personality that could impact how usable someone sees a system as. And so one of the questions was, is there an action here? Is there something we should do about it? Should we screen for personality traits? A question that I had was, like, are there certain professions that maybe are these personality traits are more common, where we need to like look at it with a specific lens, like nurses, teachers, something like that.
And so I think in specific kinds of domains, you might want to measure that to understand its impact. And let me give you an example, and maybe that'll make it clear. If let's say I'm coming up with a new electronic interface for the Wall Street Journal, right? A very, very conservative crowd. And so they're likely to have specific traits. I would want to be very careful to make sure that I didn't recruit people who didn't have similar personality traits in that case, because their assessment of usability, it might be impacted. We didn't used to think that. And so 20 years ago or 10 years ago, if you'd asked me, I'd be like, no, it wouldn't matter. But in this case, it might account for some of the variance. So if I went and got a bunch of surfers who were of the same age and same economic status, I might get different usability metrics from them than I would from Wall Street brokers.
Right.
If I was measuring the usability of a new Wall Street app. And so in that case, I might use it as a pre-screening tool, just to make sure. And the mini IP is only 20 questions. And so it's not like it's, the old surveys were, 100 questions. It took forever. But
right.
the short ones, you can get personality traits pretty quickly. So I think it's just for certain applications, it might be appropriate to pre-screen. Or if you see a huge difference, and if you collected personality data, you could go back and parse apart differences.
Makes sense. Yeah, it might just be something to like consider before you.
Yeah, I agree.
My last question, this is a little bit specific, but in when you talked about usability in watching others, when you studied that, was the person who was using the system like an expert, a complete novice? Do we think that makes a difference? Like how, yeah.
That's a great question. And that's one of the things that we're going to explore. So in the test that Ian did, the person was a Confederate of ours, and they performed the task without error to completion. And so, and you can see that reflected in the charts, right? The usability ratings for the watching others were significantly higher. And so and so what we're going to explore in future research is we're going to have some actual people use it to see if maybe that makes a difference, or we'll have Confederates who fail at specific elements and recover, and people who fail and don't recover. So we're going to try and explore that whole space to see, is there a sweet spot? Maybe what you do is you show a failure and a success, or you show a couple of failures and a couple of successes, and it allows people to draw more accurate conclusions. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to explore that whole space with the hope that we could then say, if you're going to do this, this is the combination of videos that you need to put together in order to match a typical use then measure scenario.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. Yeah, I think that's the last of my questions, and I know a couple people trickling off, so it's probably good to end it here. But thank you so much for all of this information and answering all of our questions. This was amazing. But I guess hand it over to Christy.
Yeah, I gotta say that was amazing, Phil. I want to go back and be one of your students now.
I literally was thinking the same thing. I was like, do I want to?
I know, like there's so much exciting research. I'm a little bit jealous of his students out there. So I do appreciate your time and this excellent talk. I just wanted to tell everybody, here's different ways that you can connect with the Houston chapter of HFES. Please connect to the people that were in the chat. We're not going to be meeting in person for a while, so we're just going to have to stay in touch like this. This talk and others that we have had will be shared on YouTube. And we have elections coming up. So I'm the current president, but we're going to have elections coming up for the new offices. So you may see that if you're on our list. And if you are not on our mailing list, please let me or Andy know, and we'll take care of that for you. Andy, did you have anything else?
I just wanted to mention the national elections, and that we have one of our own in Camille Perez, charging ahead to be the president of the national chapter or national organization. So if you are a member of National HFES, please make sure you vote. I'm not telling you who to vote for, but Camille has been very active and very helpful to Houston.
Okay, and again, here is Phil's book. I'm sure if it's as interesting as this talk, it's going to be a great read. So I would suggest picking that up. All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Phil.
Thanks for having me. Lots of fun.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Yes, and thank you, Angie, for being our moderator today. Great job.
Happy to help.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.